The world was trying to rebirth after a nuclear disaster, but everything left behind was like a nightmare rising from the ashes of the old civilizations. As Qasim stepped into the depths of the forest, he realized that an eerie silence had taken over everything. The heavy air carried the smell of decay, a sign of the radioactive soil, but the real fear struck him when he felt it deep in his chest. Something was coming toward them. The mutant animals that were about to attack their base were not only seeking to destroy them, but they were also dragging the spirits of the dead along with them. Qasim's eyes widened as he noticed movement in the dark, and his heart began to race. For a moment, amid the buzzing sounds in his ears, he couldn't even hear his own breath. His feet pressed forward with courage, but with every step, he felt something approaching, as if an eye in the darkness was following him. His whole body was filled with the sensation that something was watching them. The growing darkness in front of his eyes never seemed so threatening and merciless. Suddenly, a horrific scream echoed from the forest depths. Qasim, with fear tightening his chest, quickly turned his head but saw nothing. His heart pounded as though it would burst from his chest. His eyes caught a silhouette in the darkness. He saw it moving slowly, its shadow creeping through the somber night. In an instant, the empty black void in its eyes turned into a terrifying gaze. Coming closer with every second, he froze, because even though that creature was so far away, it felt so close, as if it were right there. As the creature slowly approached, his eyes locked onto one of their enormous bodies, and he noticed the terrifying eyes behind it. The eyes seemed to disappear into the dark ocean. Almost in an instant, a scream erupted through the grim atmosphere. The creature breathed deeply and noisily, each breath filling the space between them. Qasim tried to make sense of what was happening, but all he felt was the fear of a ghostly presence. Gradually, his body began to tremble with the painful awareness of how close these creatures were. His thoughts wavered between fleeing and surviving, but escape felt impossible. The sky accentuated the massive size of the creatures, and he felt that even the smallest movement could lead to death. But no matter how terrified he was, he couldn't look away from the things before him. Despite his struggles, the terrifying gazes of the creatures grew closer with each step. The creatures' bodies began to form into massive, horrifying shapes. Qasim feared that one of them might leap at him any second. His heart raced. With every step, the whispers of these ghostly beings turned into a nightmare. Though he couldn't see them clearly, he felt the direction of the terrifying sounds deep within him. Suddenly, a light appeared before his eyes. It was as though everything was shifting, silhouettes blurred, and the world slowly tilted. His eyes ached, and he struggled to breathe. At that moment, all he wanted was to escape the nightmare images before him. But no matter how far he went, every step felt like sinking deeper into the abyss of fear. Then, just as he thought everything had vanished, he heard a faint rustling. He knew something was behind him, but he couldn't make out what it was. A shadow seemed to rush toward him like an echo of time. His eyes struggled to focus on the terrifying figure, but he felt that behind this dreadful presence, a sinister power was lurking. Everything had paused, but only for a moment, because somewhere deep inside, amid the eerie screams, something still remained. At that moment, Qasim finally realized that the creatures weren't just physical entities. They were driven by a power, a force that pushed them forward. Fear lingered as a haunting memory, and everything Qasim saw, through his eyes, was only something close enough to terrify him. Now, to survive, there was only one thing left. Slowly, without rushing, he had to face all his fears. Qasim's heart pounded, as though it would leap from his chest with every beat, like a hammer striking. The darkness seemed to grow denser with each breath, pulling him deeper into its grip. In the creature's eyes, a light flickered, but it didn't feel like hope. It felt like a trap. His body was frozen, his hair standing on end, and even standing up had become a struggle. With every step, he could hear the creature's sounds growing closer. In the past, when humans ruled these lands, such monstrous beings had never been seen. Now, the last remnants of humanity were fading with each step. Suddenly, another scream echoed, this time from much closer. Qasim tried to block the sound with his hands, but it was inescapable. He shut his eyes for a moment, trying to figure out what to do. Should he run? Fight? But what could they fight with? They had no chance against them. He suddenly felt utterly alone, but there was something inside him that kept him standing through this terror. His survival instinct. There was no time left to wait. He had to make a decision. He quickly opened his eyes and scanned his surroundings. The forest, shaped by an ancient nuclear disaster, seemed like a curse. Every tree, every rock, every small detail felt like an eye watching them threateningly. As Qasim took a step, he realized something had snagged his foot. He bent down slowly and touched the ground. It was cold and hard. This earth, once home to humanity, now only reminded him of a world long past. But now, the ghosts of the past remained as nothing but gloomy memories. Suddenly, that terrifying sound came again. Slowly, he turned around. Among the rustling of the creatures, a dark silhouette began to emerge. Qasim, feeling his hair stand on end, took a deep breath. But this breath only deepened his fear, because this figure was different. Its arms were elongated, its skin pale, and its eyes filled with an empty darkness. Those eyes were fixed on Qasim. For a moment, it felt as though time had stopped. Between him and the creature, there were only those terrifying eyes. There was something in that gaze, something cold, merciless, watching the end of humanity. Qasim turned to flee, but his legs felt as if they were glued to the ground. With every step, he fell heavily to the earth. The creature wasn't rushing toward him. It was always there, watching him. Qasim, when he reached the riverbank, felt the cold water splash against his legs. The sensation of the water was a temporary relief. But that relief vanished quickly. Right behind him, the creature was still there, and Qasim, trembling from the effect of the sound, turned back instinctively. He took a step, then another. But no matter how far he ran, the terrifying figure was always one step closer. For a moment, something flashed in Qasim's mind. There had to be a way. He had to find a solution. But no matter what he did, the fear only deepened. The ominous beings were not just approaching him. They were taking over the entire area. The trees trembled more with each passing second, and the ground seemed eager to swallow the once-known world. Qasim closed his eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and searched for the last glimmer of hope in his mind. Then, something struck him. The creature's voices started to feel like an illusion. All the fear was just a trap that made them stronger. Qasim quickly headed toward the thickets and began to move through the narrow path. He took a deep breath, but the sounds behind him never stopped. The dark figures were closing in, watching him. There was no time left. He couldn't stop it, no matter how far he ran. That terrifying figure was always behind him. But there was something, there was a plan, a strategy. Qasim had only one chance left: to slowly face his fear and begin to unravel the mystery of these creatures. But at that moment, a deep scream echoed. When Qasim turned back for a brief moment, he realized it was impossible to go back. And in that moment, he began to understand that what was following him was not just a creature, but something beyond an enemy. As the sky continued to darken, Qasim realized that the struggle for survival would reach even more terrifying dimensions. Now, he had to face beings that would reshape not just the remnants of humanity, but the entire history of the world. But one thing was certain: this fear was only the beginning. After the nuclear disaster, the Earth was struggling to be reborn, but everything that remained seemed like a nightmare rising from the ashes of ancient civilizations. As Qasim stepped into the depths of the forest, he noticed the chilling silence that enveloped the area. The air was thick with the stench of decay, a sign of radioactive soil, but the true terror settled in his heart when he felt it. Something was approaching them, mutant creatures, not only seeking to destroy them, but dragging the souls of the dead behind them. Qasim's heart raced as he spotted movement in the darkness. For a moment, he couldn't even hear his own breath over the buzzing in his ears. Though his legs pushed forward in defiance, every step seemed to bring him closer to something, a presence that felt like a dark eye watching him. His body was consumed by the feeling of being hunted. The darkness before him seemed larger than ever, more menacing and cold. Suddenly, a horrifying scream echoed through the forest. Qasim turned his head in terror, but saw nothing. His chest felt tight as his heart pounded. His eyes, still adjusting to the night, caught a glimpse of a figure emerging from the shadows. The whole dark night seemed to stretch out as the silhouette of the creature moved forward, its terrifying gaze growing ever stronger. For a split second, Qasim froze. Even though the creature was still a distance away, its presence felt too close, as if it were right behind him. As the creature slowly drew closer, Qasim's eyes locked onto one of their colossal bodies, now visible in the darkness. The creature's eyes were abyssal, like a black ocean, threatening to pull him in. In an instant, a scream tore through the air. The creature exhaled deeply, its breaths filling the space between them. Qasim, still trying to understand what was happening, could only feel the paralyzing terror of an apparition. With each step, Qasim's body trembled. The painful awareness of how near these creatures were sinking deeper into his being. His thoughts kept wavering between flight and fight, but running felt impossible. The sky above them made the creature's scale even more monstrous, and Qasim understood with grim certainty that any movement could bring his end. Yet despite the overwhelming fear, his eyes couldn't look away. The creature's ghastly gaze grew closer with each passing second. The creature's bodies, massive and grotesque, began to take shape in the shadows. Qasim thought one might leap onto him at any moment. His heart raced. Every step, every whisper of their movement turned into a nightmare. He could not fully see them, but deep down, he could sense their presence, the terrifying whispers guiding him toward his doom. Then, a light appeared before his eyes, blurring his vision as if the world itself was shifting around him. His head ached, and it was harder to breathe. At that moment, all Qasim wanted was to escape this nightmare. But with each step, the horror within him only deepened. Suddenly, the forest became still, but it wasn't an empty silence. The ground beneath him crackled with a sinister energy. He knew something was behind him, but he couldn't bring himself to look. The shadows stirred, and the sensation of being watched intensified. Just as Qasim thought he could escape, a horrible rustling sound grew louder, and a chilling shadow rushed toward him. The creatures weren't just physical beings. They were the embodiment of the past, of suffering and forgotten memories. Qasim could feel it. The darkness wasn't just around him. It had seeped into him. The suffocating terror was no longer something external, but something intrinsic. A scream split the air again, but this time, it was coming from right behind him. Qasim tried to block it out, but the sound tore through his mind. He turned quickly and saw nothing, but the sense of being pursued only deepened. As he tried to move forward, every step felt heavier, as if his legs were becoming trapped in the very soil itself. The figure, though still distant, never wavered. It was there, watching him with a cold, unyielding gaze. And Qasim's mind raced, but he couldn't focus on anything for long. The darkness around him seemed to shift and bend, warping into grotesque shapes. His thoughts were clouded, and he felt like he was being pulled deeper into an abyss. Every step he took only brought him closer to the unknown. The creatures didn't need to chase him. They were always there in the air, in the shadows, in his mind. Just when he thought he had found a path out, his body shook violently. He felt cold and weak. The world seemed to spin. He stumbled and collapsed, his breath heavy in his chest. The creature's eyes, reflecting a cold, insatiable hunger, loomed above him, waiting. He could not escape. They had him. The horror wasn't just about what was chasing him. It was what they represented. Memories of the past, human suffering, lost hopes, all of it coming back to consume him. Qasim, drained of all hope, realized the final truth. The creatures were not the end. They were the beginning of something much worse. This wasn't just a battle for survival. It was the awakening of something ancient and unstoppable. The world seemed to close in on him, the creatures now surrounding him. He felt the weight of their presence, their cold eyes fixed on him. And then in an instant, everything faded to black. The terror that had gripped his heart was nothing but an echo in the void. Qasim was gone, and the creatures remained, their eyes forever searching for the next soul to claim. This was not the end. It was only the beginning, a new chapter in the world's endless nightmare. Remember, the darkness always holds a story. Until the next terrifying tale, stay tuned with Campfire Horror Story.